Hej, Ivar Arpi här. Från och med nu är jag en del av Kvartal. Kul va? Det tycker jag i alla fall. Kanske lite oväntat, eller inte alls oväntat. Jag vet inte. Men nu är jag här i alla fall och jag har tagit med mig mina 2 poddar. För dig som följer Kvartal innebär det att du nu får ytterligare 2 poddavsnitt varje vecka. I podden Rak höger med Ivar Arpi så intervjuar jag framträdande politiker, akademiker eller författare. Eller bara människor som är intressanta på något sätt. Och i podden Under all kritik som jag har ihop med Anna-Karin Windham så slår vi både näven och handväskan i bordet om aktuella och rykande inaktuella händelser. Och båda poddarna utkommer som sagt en gång i veckan. För dig som ännu inte har blivit prenumerant antingen på Kvartal eller på min Substack Rak höger så betyder det här att du nu kan få all min journalistik och hela resten av Kvartal med en enda prenumeration. Och just nu så får du första månaden helt gratis om du går till kvartal.se/testa Ivar. Gör det, tycker jag. Testa Ivar. För då kan du lyssna på hela avsnitten av mina 2 poddar, helt reklamfritt dessutom. Och så får du hela Kvartals växande utbud på köpet, inklusive alla poddar i fullversioner och utan reklam, som du kan höra direkt i Kvartals app eller i exempelvis Podcaster eller Spotify. Eller där du väljer att lyssna på din podd. Så gå till kvartal.se/testa Ivar för att testa det nya och växande Kvartal helt gratis första månaden. Tänk själv, som de säger här på Kvartal. Men gör som jag säger och testa Ivar.
Muslims are more difficult to integrate than other immigrant groups. Or rephrased, they don't integrate to the same degree as others do. Even when taken into account country of origin, level of education, and other factors, the difference still remains. Why is that? In today's episode, I'm speaking with Ruth Koopmans, who is probably the most qualified of all to answer this question. He's a sociologist, a professor at Humboldt University of Berlin, who has focused his research on migration, integration, and transnationalization, which led him to also look into religion. And he's conducted several very large surveys in a number of European countries to compare attitudes and other factors of majorities and minorities. And he's repeatedly found the worrying result that a large proportion of the Muslim population in Western countries have fundamentalist or Islamist attitudes. I first wrote about his findings in 2015, and since then he's published a book on the subject, Het Vervallen Huis van de Islam, which was originally published in Dutch, and I'm sorry that I butchered the Dutch language like that. It was published in 2019, and also I should mention that I butcher the English language so much that I managed to convince Ruth that I am actually a Muslim, which I'm not. But the book was also translated into German and Danish in 2020, and the year after that into Norwegian, but not into English or Swedish. So I had to read it in Danish with the title Islams Forfallne Hus, which could be translated as The Decayed House of Islam. In this book, he traces the problems within the Muslim communities in the West back to their countries of origin. As he writes, the causes of the Islamic crisis can be summarized in 3 key problems: the lack of separation between religion and state, the discrimination against women, and the lack of respect for secular knowledge. Today's episode is about this and more. But now on to today's guest. You're listening to Rak höger with me, Ivar Arpi. Welcome, Ruth Koopmans, to Rak höger.
Hi, nice to be here.
Did I pronounce your name correctly?
Perfectly.
Perfectly. I've read you for a very long time, and a very long time for me is since like 2011, I think, when I first encountered your science and your writings, and then a series of articles appeared recently in Sweden in the publication Kvartal, and a journalist named Henrik Höjer had written about your latest book, or the next latest book, and he also did an interview with you, and I said, damn, why did he think of that and not me? So I'm basically just doing the same thing. So I read your book, and I cannot pronounce the name in Dutch, but in it's basically Islams förfallna hus, eller Islams förfallna hus, if you say it in Danish.
Het vervallen huis van de islam.
Yes, that's it. Very easy. And it's a remarkable book. And what you're doing in that book is basically you're collecting investigations, science surveys from all over Europe. Many of them you've done yourself and together with other scientists. And you try to explain. Yes, what are you trying to explain really in the book? Why did you write the book?
I wrote the book because I'm a migration and integration researcher, and in the context of that work, I found that immigrants from Muslim countries of origin tend to do worse than immigrants from other parts of the world. And that's a finding that I did a lot of comparative research across different immigration countries. And it basically doesn't matter which country you look at, be it Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands, Austria, France, United Kingdom, everywhere. It is the immigrants from Muslim countries of origins that tend to do worst in terms of school achievements of children, labor market participation, degree of residential segregation, degree of intermarriage with members of the host society, identification with the host country. So a whole range of indicators of integration. And that's something that was actually new in the literature on immigration and integration, because many of my colleagues have a tendency to shy away from attributing any importance to cultural or religious factors in explaining integration outcomes. But I found that that's actually the most important factor, more important than socioeconomic background. That made me curious, okay, where does this come from? Does this have something to do with the situation in the countries of origin of these immigrants? Because, they don't become like that here. It's more like something they take from their countries of origin. And that was the point of departure for the book, looking at the countries of the Muslim world and look how they are performing compared to other parts of the world. And also to find out why this was the case and what the role of religion or of certain forms of religion, especially religious fundamentalism, was in explaining these differences between the Muslim world and the rest of the world. Because the finding in the book is that I look at democracy, I look at human rights, I look at economic development, I look at war and peace, I look at terrorism, and I find that in all these regards, the countries of the Muslim world are doing not only worse than the countries of the West. You might say that's because of historical advantage of the West, but also when you compare within the non-Western world, you see that countries with a majority Muslim population are doing worse than those, for instance, in Christian sub-Saharan Africa or in Latin America or the non-Muslim parts of South and East Asia. And another remarkable thing is that this has not always been the case. So I start my investigation for some of the aspects in the 1950s, others in the 1970s. But basically what you can see is that until the beginning of the 1970s, there's not much of a difference in all these regards between Muslim countries and non-Muslim countries, also non-Western, non-Muslim countries. But from the 1970s onwards, the rest of the world basically has developed in the direction of democracy, in the direction of more recognition of human rights, a decline in the number and intensity of armed conflicts, a decline in the level of terrorism. And in the Muslim world, you see precisely the opposite happening. And in economic growth, we see that there's economic growth everywhere in the world, but the levels of economic growth are much lower in the Muslim majority countries, which means that also the economic divide between the Muslim world and the non-Muslim world is getting larger and larger.
And if you just accept that to begin with, there are nuances and everything we'll get to, but just what is the main cause? Why does the Muslim world begin to, if you take 1970s, for example, what happens in the 1970s that made the Muslim world stagnate more, and countries like South Korea, Vietnam, or very poor countries in the 1970s, to Southeast Asia, but that are not so poor anymore? And
yeah, I use the example of South Korea, for instance. In the beginning of the 1970s, South Korea and Egypt were at a similar level of economic development and a similar GDP per capita. Now South Korea is one of the richest countries in the world, and Egypt has stagnated on a very low level and has fallen relatively to other countries in the rank of countries. So what happened in the 1970s is the rise of Islamic religious fundamentalism. And the key year there is 1979, which I discuss at length in the book, where we basically saw the breakthrough of religious fundamentalist movements in the Muslim world. They go back a lot further. The beginning of Islamic fundamentalism is in the aftermath of the First World War, when also the Muslim Brotherhood was, for instance, established in Egypt. It was a way of coping with the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in the First World War, the breakdown of the Caliphate, and the realization in many parts of the Muslim world that it had gotten fatally behind the West, and had lost the battle against the West, which it has long regarded as being inferior to the Muslim world. So there was a search for answers for this relative decline of the Muslim world, and one such answer was Islamic fundamentalism, namely the idea we need to go back to the roots of Islam, to the kind of Islam of the times of the Prophet Muhammad. Then we were a glorious empire, we dominated all other parts of the world, we were expanding, flourishing. So if only we go back to this original Islam, then our former glory will also be reestablished. After the First World War, this was not the dominant current in the Muslim world. The dominant current was actually one of modernization, of trying to imitate the West. The Shah of Iran, Ataturk in Turkey, they basically tried, sometimes in very clumsy ways and superficial ways, to imitate the West, and were to some extent successful for a while, but this model also stagnated because they didn't copy some of the essential elements of the West, namely freedom and democracy. These were authoritarian rulers, and in the end, that secular form of modernization did not bring the success that was hoped for. And when then also the Arab countries lost several wars against Israel, this secular modernization program had basically lost its credibility in the Muslim world. And that's when the answer that the fundamentalists were given became much more popular. And in 1979, we saw three events: the Islamic Revolution in Iran, disposing of the Shah and bringing Ayatollah Khomeini to power. We saw the start of the civil war in Afghanistan, the rebellion by Islamists against the communist regime there, which then soon had to be saved by the Soviets, who invaded the country. And the third event, the least well known of them, but maybe certainly not the least important, was an attempt in Mecca, in Saudi Arabia, to occupy, or it was an occupation of the central mosque in Mecca, the most holy place in the Muslim world, by several hundreds of jihadists, Saudi jihadists. And they basically demanded the withdrawal of all Western troops from the Middle East. And they also demanded that an Islamic State should be introduced in Saudi Arabia. Now, this was crushed by the Saudi army, but not until the Saudi government had made some serious concessions to the Islamic clergy, the ulama in Saudi Arabia, and they believed that they would strengthen Islamic law in Saudi Arabia, and very importantly, they would invest a lot of money into the propagation of Salafi Islam in the world. And from 1979 onwards, you see that Saudi Arabia, and then in response also countries like Qatar and the United Arab Emirates, start investing billions of dollars into the propagation of a fundamentalist Islam all across the world. And if you now travel the Islamic world from Senegal to Indonesia, you will see, or also on the Balkans, you see everywhere new mosques. And who has built these new mosques? It's Qatar, the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and lately also Turkey, especially in the Balkans. And it's not only in mosque construction, also in Islamic education. So Saudi Arabia and other Islamic states, also Egypt, started inviting Muslims from other countries with scholarships to be trained in Islamic theology in Cairo or in Mecca or in Iran. And when these people returned to their home countries, they also started spreading the fundamentalist version of Islam. And because it was backed by a lot of oil money, this was a very successful missionary effort. And if you look at the origins of jihadi and fundamentalist movements, basically in any country of the Muslim world, if you trace the origins, you end up in the end with some people who came back from one of these Islamic seminaries in Saudi Arabia or other such countries and brought fundamentalist Islam, for instance, to Nigeria. If you take Nigeria, Boko Haram goes back to a couple of people who went to the University of Khartoum, in this case, financed with Saudi money, got their training into a very strict form of fundamentalist Islam there, and then started propagating that Islam, helped with money provided again by the Saudis to construct mosques, to set up madrasas where Islamic theology was taught. And in this way, the kind of quite pluralist and heterogeneous Islam that we still had until the 1970s has become in large parts of the Muslim world a very homogeneous and very strict and fundamentalist form of Islamic teaching.
And if I came of a political consciousness, so to speak, in around 2001, I was 18. I was 19 years old. No, I was 18. Anyway, and if you just try to remember the Swedish debates, there were a lot of debates about George W. Bush being an American crusader, cowboy, sort of hating Islam and all that. But something you bring up in the book as a reaction, a common reaction in the West was actually, and you quote him, that he says that Islam is a religion of peace, and this is not about Islam. And also later on in 2016, when the Islamic State were top of mind for a lot of us, and they had occupied a large area in Syria and Iraq. Barack Obama, who was then president, he also talked about this. They do not represent Islam, and his minister of foreign affairs, Hillary Clinton, said something similar. And you can understand when we talk about Islam now and fundamentalism as a problem, and it is, but you also have different kinds of Islam. But as you say, when you discuss this in the book, you say there are two reactions that are perhaps not equally destructive, but one is that the fundamentalists are basically right, and Islam, this is the true Islam, and that's why we can't have any of it. And then you have the opposite reaction, is they are this is not the real Islam. The real Islam is great for women, for homosexuals, for minorities, and it's very peaceful. And both of those reactions are there are, I think you call it an either or you're 100% against or 100% for. But can you explain why both of those sort of reactions doesn't get anywhere?
Yeah, let me start with the idea that fundamentalism is some sort of marginal aberration from true and peaceful Islam that is only supported by a very marginal group of people. That's a serious underestimation of the degree to which Islamic fundamentalism is rooted in the populations of many Muslim countries. There are meanwhile lots of survey data available from Muslim countries around the world, which show, for instance, for a country such as Afghanistan, that support for Sharia as the basis for the law of the land is way above 90% in the population. And if you follow up and asking about specific aspects of Sharia, for instance, that people who commit adultery should be stoned to death, then you find that large majorities of the population even support these extreme forms of Sharia rights. And Afghanistan is an extreme case, but you find that in virtually every country in the Muslim world, there is majority support for Sharia law as the law of the land, including big countries such as Egypt. There are a couple of exceptions. Turkey is one, Albania and Bosnia on the Balkans, and the Central Asian countries, Kazakhstan, etc. These are countries that either went through secular politics under Ataturk or under communism in the Balkans and in Central Asia. So there are exceptions, but the core states of the Muslim world on the Arabian Peninsula, in North Africa, or in Pakistan, for instance, in all these countries, there's majority support for Sharia law, even in its extreme form. So is clear in the real existing Islam that we're dealing with right now is dominated by fundamentalist versions of Islam. That doesn't mean that there are no moderate Muslims and no Muslim reformers, but in these countries, they are usually in jail or they are in the diaspora in exile.
I was just gonna cut in because you had like an imam called Kashif Virk who responded in Kvartal to your book and Henrik Höjer's articles, and Kashif Virk is a great guy. We often disagree, and I've met him several times, and he often disagrees with me when I talk about Islamism, and because he thinks I'm too negative. And maybe he's right. I don't think he is. But the ironic thing is that he lives in Sweden because in his native country, his form of Islam is not recognized by the majority. He's an Ahmadiyya Muslim. Yeah. And so I disagree with him about Islam, but the debate we're having basically is between two non-believers in the eyes of a fundamentalist Muslim. So,
well, not just a fundamentalist Muslim. In Pakistan, that's just the law. Ahmadiyya are not Muslims. Ahmadiyya are not allowed to call their houses of worship mosques. They are not allowed to call their book the Quran, etc. And they're heavily persecuted there. They are under constant attack from fundamentalists. So this is not just that they're not accepted by fundamentalists. They're just not accepted by the whole of Pakistan, or at least by Pakistani law. It's just an official fact. So yeah, that's clearly not a tenable position. But the other position, to say that fundamentalist Islam is actually true Islam, is also incorrect, because it also flies in the fact of historical facts. It flies in the fact first of the fact that there are liberal Muslims, there are Muslim reformers, and especially among Muslims in Western countries, for obvious reasons, because there's less persecution. We find these voices to be stronger than in the countries of the Muslim world. So first of all, if you would say fundamentalist Islam is the real Islam, then you basically give up on all these people that should actually be on our side. I would say that's what we should support these people, and you don't support these people by saying, well, the kind of Islam that you're propagating, a liberal kind of Islam, that's not real Islam. Then you're basically siding with the fundamentalists. And of course, historically, it's not correct, because, as I said at the beginning, until the 1970s, there wasn't much difference between the Muslim world and the rest of the non-Western world. The divergence is of recent date, of the last 60 years or so, since the rise of Islamic fundamentalism. And if you go further back in history, you want to talk about human rights or the rights of religious minorities, it is not untrue what defenders of the Muslim case often say, that, until the 19th century, you were better off as a Jew in the Ottoman Empire than in many European countries. So religious tolerance for many parts of Islamic history was larger than it was in many parts of the Christian world. Not because people, also Muslims in the Ottoman Empire, were so tolerant by our current standards, but for the standards of the time, relatively speaking, they were either similar or in some respects and in some periods even more tolerant, and also economically more developed. And it's not until, say, the 15th century or so, there was no lag economically or in terms of technological innovation between the Muslim world and the West. And in the beginnings of Muslim expansion in the centuries immediately after Muhammad, of course, the Islamic world was way ahead of Western Europe. So we are dealing with a real existing Islam in the current world, which is dominated by fundamentalism. That is true. But this is not the only Islam that is possible. It is not the only Islam that we have seen historically, and therefore it's also not the only Islam that is possible for the future.
When you talk about as you say, you've written and done research on integration, and that has been one of your, maybe the main focus on a lot of your research. And it's like the sticky problem of Islam as an obstacle for integration has reappeared in your studies. It's not that if you come from Senegal or if you come from Nigeria and you're a Christian and you come to France, it's just super easy as coming there and integrating. There are still obstacles, but
super easy, I wouldn't say. But
no, it's not super easy. It's you still have a lot of obstacles, and there are a lot of commonalities, of course, you face as an immigrant, regardless of where you come from. But you also point out in the book in what ways that Muslim immigrants have a harder time, or why they have more obstacles, perhaps either self-imposed or from the society they immigrate to, and you have very interesting data to use. For example, you use from the Indian province of Gujarat. My pronunciation is awful, but you have Indian Hindus and Muslims from the same region speaking the same language.
Yep.
To Britain, and you also have Lebanese Christians and Muslims, and they immigrate during the same time. And if you try to be as racist as you can, but you only have like your Swedish background, it can be hard as a racist, if you're trying to be racist, to see the difference in the appearance or in the names between an Hindu and a Muslim from the same region. So you could assume, at least, that if you're not a super racist that can really like pinpoint your racism, you would be equally racist or discriminatory towards Lebanese Christians and Lebanese Muslims. And so these are some of the cases you bring up, as they are pretty similar. It's not totally similar, but still you find that the Muslims compared to their compatriots or people with the same origin, they lag behind. And why is that?
Yeah, that's because of a number of indirect effects that religion, if it is lived in an orthodox and or fundamentalist way, has on mechanisms that are very important for integration. One is segregation. So if you live a strict version of Islam, or also a strict version of Judaism, or a strict version of Christianity for that matter, the religion demands that you have your primary interactions within your own religious group. For instance, there's a very clear ban in...
Get ready Sweden! BetMGM är här. Nu kan du uppleva spänningen från Las Vegas i mobilen. Ta chansen att spela på Bellagio roulettepool eller våra exklusiva MGM-slots. BetMGM, kasino och sport i mobilen. Åldersgräns 18 år. Regler och villkor gäller.
Trippelt välkommen tillbaka säger vi till cheeseburgarnas cheeseburgare. Ja, vi pratar såklart om triple cheese på McDonalds. Lika god som vår cheeseburgare, fast trippelt. Bara på McDonalds.
Tänk om din plånbok kunde prata. Vad skulle den då säga om din relation till ekonomi?
Alla relationer har ju sina ups and downs. Men att han har lån lite här och där, det tror jag skulle vara en ick för rätt många plånböcker och inte bara för mig.
Ett första steg mot en bättre relation till sin plånbok kan vara att samla sina lån. Samla dina lån till ett på lendo.se.
In Islam, on marrying non-Muslims, especially for Muslim women, it's an absolute ban. For men, okay, the woman can convert to Islam. So that's a big barrier to intermarriage. And you see indeed that intermarriage rate between Muslims, even if they come from the same country of origin, and non-Muslims from the same country of origin, is widely different. And intermarriage is like the king's highway to integration success, because that's, of course, the quickest and fullest way to become part of the host society, by marrying somebody from that society. Okay, but it doesn't have to be marriage. It's also about, friendships or contacts with neighbors. But what happens if you are a very strict believer, a very strict Muslim believer? Well, then you will insist, for instance, that your wife and your daughters have no contact with males who are not close family members. So no kids from your daughter's or even your son's school coming to play at your home, because they would then, be with your daughters or with your wife. That's not possible. You cannot have a nice dinner together with your Swedish neighbors. That will not happen, because then the sexes would have to intermingle. So this leads to a relatively strong degree of segregation of Muslim communities. And you see that also in the places where they live. They tend to live much more segregated than other immigrant communities. Mm-hmm. And then there's the role of women, very important. In Muslim households, usually only one person works, the man, if anybody works. But let's assume the man works, but women almost never work in Muslim communities. Also in Western Europe, maybe a bit more in Sweden than in other countries, because of course the general rate of female labor market participation is very high in Sweden, but also in Sweden there's a big gap between Muslims and the average of the population, and that gap is much bigger than between other immigrant groups and the average of the population. And that has something very clearly to do, of course, with Islamic rules, strict Islamic rules, again, which forbid the participation of women in public life outside of the family, and define it as the role of the woman to, take care of the household and of the children. So, and that again has consequences. If you have only one breadwinner, you of course have a lower household income. And marriages, because marriage outside of, or sex outside of marriage is strictly forbidden in Islam and in other orthodox forms of religion. But fundamentalism happens to be much more widespread in Muslim communities than in other religious communities. It leads to very early marriage, because if you cannot have sex outside marriage, people marry very young. They have children very young also. And it means that often they marry at the time when they haven't finished their education, which means for women, usually at the moment they marry, they drop out of education altogether. And even many of the men give up education and start earning money, because they have to sustain a family. And early marriage, again, plus a one breadwinner model leads to a higher number of children. So we have a syndrome in Muslim families of a lower family income, a higher number of children, which means that the average attention and also money that families can invest in the education of their children is also less than in families who marry later, where both parents work and where there are fewer children. And you see that again in the school results of children from Muslim immigrant families. They do much worse than those from other families. And that's partly because of lower household income, larger number of children.
Yeah, I realized I was when I read this, I was I looked at the statistics you present very pedagogically in the book, and then I this is awful. This is very bad. And then I realized, like, I'm a Muslim in this statistic because I'm the sole breadwinner in the family, and my wife is at home with the kids. We have 4 kids, and we might have more. So. Like I'm really, the only thing left now is for a formal conversion, and I fit right into the statistic. But there are there are also more, like, if you look at these hard measures, there are softer measures, so to speak, and you have done surveys throughout European countries when you ask, for example, about attitudes towards Jews, towards the Western world, towards women, and towards homosexuals. And you've compared also, we've touched upon that you also can, you find a lot of difference with the mainstream society within very Orthodox or very conservative Christian sects. And of course, we know that in the ultra Orthodox Jews in Israel, they have very different attitudes than the main population of secular Jews in Israel. But what do you find then when you look at the attitudes with and compare these different Christian Orthodox sects and fundamentalist Christians and fundamentalist Muslims? Are they very similar then, and it's just that we have more fundamentalist Muslims and that's the problem? Or what do you find?
They are quite similar. If you look at very Orthodox Christians, be they of native origin or of immigrant origin, we also have Orthodox Christians, for instance, from African countries who are Christian but adhere to a quite Orthodox conservative form of Christianity. We find similar results in relation to attitudes towards the role of women or attitudes towards homosexuals, hostility towards homosexuals, or even, the support for banning homosexuality by law, or support among Muslims for the death penalty for homosexuals in their countries of origin. That is not very different among Orthodox Christians. The point is, however, there are just a lot fewer of these Orthodox Christians, at least percentage-wise. In absolute numbers, of course, because the Christian population in Europe still is larger than the Muslim population. It's not a completely negligible problem, and I would certainly say it's not a negligible problem if we look at a country like the United States, where the parts of the Christian population that adheres to fundamentalist forms of Christianity. We see it in the election campaign now, also in relation to the topic of abortion, for instance, or reproductive rights, whether fertility treatments are allowed or not. So in the USA, that certainly is a problem. In Europe, with its high rate of secularizations, where most Christians are Christians in name, but, and maybe in morals, maybe, but not in terms of any strict adherence to the rules of the Bible or to whatever religious leaders would say. And that is different for Muslim communities in the West, where we find that, depending a bit on the country that we investigated, we find between 30 and almost 60% of the Muslim population adhering to strict fundamentalist version of Islam, and among Christians that is in the order of magnitude of maybe 4 or 5% or so of the Christian population. So that's very different, and it's not innocent. It's not innocent because of what we talked about before: segregation, non-participation of women, etc. But also in terms of attitudes towards the countries in which they live, towards other minorities, and towards the West in general, because this fundamentalism is very strongly linked to hostility towards all kinds of outgroups. So we find a very high rejection of homosexuality, for instance, among fundamentalist Muslims. We find a very strong anti-Semitism also. That is not something new. Some people seem to think that, since 7th of October, we're suddenly seeing Muslim anti-Semitism, but that has been around the whole time. It just comes out more now because of the events in Gaza, as it did when there was something going on in Gaza also in the past, by the way. But if you look at the results of surveys, then that anti-Semitism has always been there and characterizes at least a large minority, and in some countries even a majority of the Muslims. And the same is true for rejection of the West. So the idea of fundamentalist Islam is also that there is a basic opposition in the world between believers and non-believers, and especially between Islam and the West. The West is seen, together with the Jews, as the arch enemy of Islam. And if we ask in our surveys people whether they agree to the statement, the West is out to destroy Islam, then we find around 60% or more of Muslims in European countries saying yes to that statement. And it's often also linked to conspiracy theories that, the West or the Jews are also behind things that actually Muslims did, like the events of 9/11 or the events of 7 October, where many think that this was just Israel, or it was the United States themselves who just instigated and conspired these events to blame Muslims. Because and that those are ideas that unfortunately have widespread support within Muslim communities and tightly linked to this fundamentalist ideology.
If you look at when we talk we have a pretty frank discussion right now, and I only say that because I know it's hard to talk about these issues. And one of the frustrating things I can, if you're a researcher in these areas, I can see, you write about it in the book, is that it's hard to come by statistics because you seem to lack in many countries. We have had a big debate in Sweden for a long while. But as you can see in the book, as you can when you read about it, you can see that this is not just a Swedish problem or like a Swedish phenomenon. It's a phenomenon that goes on in many Western European countries. Is that it's very hard to find who were the victims, who were the perpetrators, what were the motives. We are really good at collecting data if it was right-wing extremism or left-wing extremism, but many of these a bit newer things, like was it a fundamentalist Islamist? Was it what was the motive? Was it what we're talking about here, and why? And I know that you have been maligned by some Islamologists. Islamology? How do you say Islamologists? Islamic scholars, scholars of Islam.
Scholars of Islam, that's the right.
Yes, but not theologians. But you have been maligned by them, and if you say that you want more statistics on these things, you also run the risk of being labeled a racist, or Islamophobe is a common epithet as well. So, why is there such hesitancy to even gather data on these issues? And you are you are one of a few who do research about this, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, that already signals that there are actually two problems. There's the problem of research and there's the problem of statistics. To begin with, there is very little research on these topics. On the topic of, when I published my first research on fundamentalism among Muslim immigrant communities in Europe, that was, when was that published? In 2015. I was the first. Why? This was 14 years after 9/11, and many, I mean, several decades after the Rushdie affair. Why hadn't anybody? Why wasn't there any social science scholar that had the idea we should maybe, survey the attitudes among Muslim immigrant populations in relation to fundamentalism, which is obviously something that's on the rise in the Muslim world, is having effects in the forms of attacks in Western countries. Also, we need to know more about this, but most social science scholars are not interested in investigating this because it could, it has the potential or even the probability that you uncover something that people don't want to be true. Namely, that there is actually a problem with fundamentalist Islam, and that it's not just because of discrimination, because that's the popular answer. That sort of, you can wake up a social science scholar in the middle of the night and you say, an attack has happened in Stockholm yesterday. What do you think are the causes? Is discrimination, social marginalization, it's too difficult to get equal rights, etc., or they're traumatized, or it's, there's a standard set of answers. But
you forgot toxic masculinity, I think.
Yeah, toxic masculinity, indeed, something that also is then very general and it affects whole society. Those are the standard answers, and to even investigate the role of religion or culture more generally is something that for many social science scholars is simply not done. They suspect their basic assumption is that culture and religion don't matter. In that sense, social sciences are still very Marxist in the end. It all has to be explained by social inequalities. Plus, we have now done sort of in identity politics time, discrimination and marginalization, and racism and colonialism, etc. That's all fine. That can be used as an explanation, but that it has something to do with the characteristics and the choices of the immigrant group themselves, that is just taboo. So that explains why there's very little research, and why, I sometimes feel quite alone in doing research on these topics, and it makes you also very vulnerable, of course, because there's a lot of people who want to deny and not want to recognize the importance of such factors, and you alone, almost alone, and there are a couple more, of course, but very few. We are the only ones who have to produce information and data that actually shows that yes, culture and religion do matter. And then we have official statistics. There, fortunately, otherwise I would not have been able to write my book. The situation is a little bit better. If you study Muslim countries of origin, for instance, you can compare them to other countries in the world, because there are super good statistics on democracy, on economic development, on human rights, etc. And also within countries, it differs a bit from country to country, but I believe in Sweden that's also pretty well organized. There are very good statistics on labor market participation, on educational achievements, and also not by religion, but at least by country of origin. And in some countries, even for the second generation who maybe have become Swedes or Dutch already, we know also about performance of different groups with different types of immigration background. That's why I was able to do, for instance, the comparison in the book between Hindus from Gujarat in India and Muslims from Gujarat in India, or Lebanese Muslims or Lebanese Christians in Australia. That's because there are statistics. The one area where there are no such statistics is crime. And the reason is a bit similar to the reason why there's so little social science research on fundamentalism and on cultural factors more generally. It is because if we would have good statistics on crime and migration background, the very probable outcome of this is that we would see that there is a very strong overrepresentation of people with migration background in the crime statistics, and especially in violent forms of crime, of heavy forms of violence and also sexual violence. Why do I know that? Because we do have statistics in all countries on nationality and crime. And they already show, for instance, for Germany, we have about 12% foreign nationals in Germany. But if you look at the crime statistics on heavy forms of physical assault and murder, attempted murder, or heavy forms of sexual violence, such as rape, then we see that around 40% of all crimes in these areas are committed by people with a foreign nationality. But that does not yet include the very large population that has a migration background, but that has meanwhile become Swedish, Dutch, or German. They appear in the general category in the 60% of Germans, but some of them do have a migration background. It would, of course, be very good for, as a social scientist, one would want to have statistics that also include migration background, just as we have these statistics for unemployment or for school performance. The only problem is that if it's crime, then it becomes very difficult to blame this on the host society and then to say, we need more money for education and more, then, something else is going on, especially if you also see that if we're talking about immigrants and crime, we cannot generalize at all. There are huge differences in the involvement in criminal activities across different ethnic groups, across different national origin, huge. So, there are some immigrant groups, for instance, those from East and Southeast Asia, who have involvement in crime lower than the average of the population, or EU immigrants, similar levels or only slightly higher. But if we look at immigrants from countries such as Afghanistan or Somalia or Nigeria, then we find much, much higher levels of involvement in and we're talking about heavy crime, it's not just pickpocketing, or you could say that's explained by social factors, etc., and poverty, etc. But we're talking about heavy forms of criminal activity.
I mean, it's not really, if you take away the Islam part and you also take away the Middle Eastern component, if you look at the United States, you can, if you go back a little bit in time, you have a lot of these problems are not new when it comes to like the stickiness of culture. You have Irish migration and also Scottish migration to the Appalachians, and they give rise to these great mythologies of the West, like the Hatfields and McCoys, and you have like the clan mentality, and it's great if you're looking at a movie. Like you have these gangs going out and shooting each other, and then going out westwards and basically like shooting Indians and being shot, and I mean, extremely violent, and many of them came from very violent cultures. And then you can see like there's a lot of studies on these topics, and you have clashes of cultures from the Anglos or the Wasps and the immigrants from the south of Italy and from Portugal and the Irish and then like how can we integrate these people? But you don't have they didn't have a different, like, okay, the Italians had a different complexion a little bit, but basically it's a very cultural thing, and you acknowledge it and you recognize it, and you do a lot of research into it. But like here now, as you say, when you did that study in 2015, that's 26 years after Salman Rushdie got dealt the fatwa from Iran, and it's a lot of water had passed under the bridge. You could. It's much easier, really, to, if you just come as an alien from outer space and you say, oh, you had like really big terrorist attacks from people saying they were doing it in God's name, and they're targeting your societies. Of course, you will look into it, and you will do what you can to protect the population, and also understand why it's happening, and understand these people and their motivations. And instead, you've had a lot of hand-wringing and a lot of political deadlock in these issues. And you bring up like the charge of Islamophobia, and I think it's there are of course cases, and there are people who hate Muslims. Like they don't care if it's a fundamentalist, if it's an Ahmadiyya, or who they are. But I'm from Iran. I actually fled from Khomeini. I'm just a moderate Muslim. I was about to be killed if I was say, oh, you're just the same, all of you Muslims from the Muslim world. That kind of hatred or racism is of course real, but the term, as you explain in the book, it's not really used like that, and there are like legitimate concerns, even though you also recognize the diversity within Islam. I'm sorry, it wasn't a question. Yeah. I just tried to like tell you what you had written.
Yeah. No, I definitely agree. I just, as a reaction, maybe I just want to say that if I look at the people who are sort of on my side in the political debate in the Netherlands and in Germany, then these are very, very disproportionately people who themselves have a Muslim background. The negative reactions to my book, they come overwhelmingly from, say, white, non-Muslim Germans and Dutch who think that one should not say such harsh things about the minority. The support that I get very often comes from moderate, liberal Muslims as yourself, who are relieved that finally somebody...
I'm not a Muslim. I'm just going to say, okay, I'm not a
Muslim. But you're from a Muslim, from a Muslim country.
No, I'm not from a Muslim country. I have a Finnish last name.
Okay.
So we're it's that's why. But I'm not.
I'm sorry. I thought you were just saying that. I wasn't assuming that originally, but.
Oh, sorry.
But people from Muslim majority countries. It's sometimes Muslims. It's sometimes also people from a minority context in Muslim countries, or it is people who no longer believe, who are seculars, but who come from a Muslim country. Those are the people that I find most common ground with, and with whom I can very easily talk about these things. And we may sometimes disagree on some of the details, but by and large, these people are happy with the kind of research that I'm doing, because they are actually the primary victims, both in their countries of origin and in the immigrant communities here, of the rise of fundamentalist Islam. And they are extremely annoyed by the fact that both on the left and on the right, I would say, there is a denial in regard to the role of Islamism and religious fundamentalism, and a lack of daring to speak out, because everybody is so afraid to be called an Islamophobe, and everybody is so afraid to play into the hands of right-wing populists. That's what I'm always told. Yes, you're right, but you shouldn't say it because you play in the hands of, or providing fuel to. No. Not speaking about these things, that is providing fuel to right-wing populists. Not speaking also about, for instance, the issue of the relationship between immigration and crime. If you don't speak about it, you leave the topic to the right-wing populists. They are the ones who address it then, and they will address it in extremely magnified and one-sided ways, but they're also addressing a real problem that nobody else wants to address. Then they have the playing field to themselves, and they will win the battle. And we see that time and time over again. Now we have in Germany this debate again after the Islamist attack in Solingen, in which 3 people were killed. So we have a short-lived debate now on Islamism. It will pass in a couple of weeks or even days again, as it always does. But true effective measures have not been taken so far.
Thank you, Ruud Koopmans, for being part of Rak Höger.
Yeah, thank you. This was a nice conversation. Thank you.
Och stort tack till er som lyssnar. Och detta är alltså en del av en större publikation på Substack med samma namn som podden, och du hittar alltihop på www.enrakhöger.se. Och har ni några frågor eller synpunkter så tveka inte att höra av er på ivararpi@substack.com. Vi hörs om en vecka igen. Och där tog det stopp. Ja, Ivar Arpi här igen. Om du vill höra resten av den här podden så måste du vara prenumerant på Kvartal, som jag nu har blivit en del av. Om du redan är prenumerant på min Substack rak höger så blir du nu automatiskt prenumerant på Kvartal och kan logga in i Kvartals app med din mailadress. Så kolla din mail för mer information. Men om du inte ännu är prenumerant på rak höger eller Kvartal så kan du testa att bli det i en månad helt gratis på kvartal.se/testa-Ivar. Så för att testa mig, mina poddar, mina texter och resten av Kvartals texter och poddar gratis första månaden, gå till kvartal.se/testa-Ivar så kan du börja med att höra resten av den här podden.